Hello and welcome to the CSIAC podcast. Today is an interview in a webinar follow-up series podcast, and today I am here with Kevin Joyce. And Kevin, you just what's your title in
I'm
your
a
work?
senior information technologist here at Quantarian Solutions.
And also a part of the CSIAC. And Kevin just gave a webinar on DFARS CUI compliance for federal contractors, and we're just doing a little interview and questionnaire to maybe fill in some of the gaps that may have been lingering from the webinar and give a little bit more insight. So let's just start off. Can you just briefly explain what CUI is, just for those who don't know or aren't familiar?
Yes, well, CUI is Controlled Unclassified Information. It's actually an information system reform that came out of an executive order by President Obama. But the actual impetus for the CUI program came out of a memo from George Bush after 9/11. After 9/11, it was discovered that a number of government agencies weren't able to share information because they classified the information differently from one agency to the next. So the CUI program was designed to come up with a standard means of categorizing information so that all government agencies could share that information and have the same designations and markings on the documents.
Okay, so when were people supposed to? So these CUI guidelines in the NIST, what was the number? 800.
NIST 800-171.
Yeah, so federal contractors are required to abide by those and implement those, or at least have a security plan in place, correct?
Yes.
And when were they supposed to have that by?
That was December 31st, 2017. Now, the federal government has been following these regulations for years, but DFARS decided that, or came out with regulations that said that contractors had to have a plan implemented by December 31st, 2017.
And you think all the federal contractors were meeting those, or were there any complications with that?
I have no way of knowing what everybody else did, but I know there was confusion, especially for a lot of smaller companies. And there were some talks given about whether or not they actually had to meet that December 31st deadline. Mm-hmm. All of the documentation and guidance I saw from DFARS and the government said, in order to be compliant, you needed to have a system security plan and a plan of action. Now, the system security plan detailed how you are currently meeting the regulations and meeting those controls. The plan of action detailed how you will meet those that are unimplemented.
So were they required, like what parts of this were they required to implement, and what were maybe just recommendations?
They were all required. If you read the DFARS documentation, it actually says that all federal contractors must have a plan in place by December 31st. Now, as far as interpretation of them, some of the controls were open to interpretation. We tended to try to stick to the government recommendation. But
so regarding controls, the acronym CCI.
Okay. Well, the CCIs were actually out of the control families. Each control within a control family had a CCI that provided supplemental information. Mm-hmm. It would give you more detailed information on that control. For example, the control that says you need to implement secure remote access. Well, within that, the CCI would be able to explain in detail how they recommended that you do that.
So which one of these CCIs do you think was hardest to implement from your own experience in implementing these?
It wasn't so much a specific CCI, but control families. The access control family was the most difficult, primarily because of the sheer volume of the controls within there. And it also reached out across a number of boundaries. You had to look at your building access control, look at your perimeter plan. How are people being logged in the building? You had to work with your facility security officer to determine when the visit requests were and what the procedure was. You had to work with your IT people. How are people getting access to the systems? How are they getting access to your data center?
Now, was there any prioritization guidelines, or like which ones you should apply and focus on first, or was it just like, here's a list and go do whichever you think is right?
No,
first?
It was really more of per organization. What we found was we looked at the total number of controls and we broke them down into spreadsheets based on the family. So that way we could say the access control will have one person working on. We could take the media access, have another person working on it. And that way you had the right people working on the right controls. Additionally, the way we did it to make it a little easier is we went through the spreadsheets the first time and looked at things that we had in place, the policies that we had, and we were able to document those in the spreadsheets right away.
So the CCIs and the control families that you already had met, you're able to document that.
Yes, and that was one of the things that we wanted to do right away. In the actually control spreadsheet, there's a column that lists whether yes, you meet it, no, you don't, or it's undocumented. Now, the ones that we knew that were undocumented, we marked them as undocumented in red. So the next time we went through the spreadsheet, we could easily find those. The ones that were yes, we're able to put in the notes exactly.
So you kind of did like a first pass through and then went back over. Okay.
And then we classified them based on what we knew we had. But we also documented at that point what procedure it was in.
Okay. So was there any CCI that didn't have enough specifications or details regarding how to implement or abide to?
Well, there were a number of them that were open to interpretation. So thinking about the entire process, it's about industry best practice and how you're best protecting your network and your data. So we tended to try to adhere to the government standards as much as possible, because all of these control families in the 800-171, they're a subset of the federal government's 800-53 series.
So since they're up for interpretation, was there a point of contact for the government in order to get more clarification on this, or is it really just up to you?
Well, the government actually issued a update, the 800-171A, in November of 2017, which provided more guidance on assessing them. There's also in the control families for each CCI, there is an assessment procedure that if you were inspecting, those are the things you'd look for, and this is how you document the fact that you're abiding by those controls.
Were there any controls that seemed a little bit too strict or maybe overkill for the facility that you were part of or implementing?
Well, yeah. I mean, there was a number of them that adhered to, they would apply to a larger company. Being a small
larger company or someone that like a much more secure, like someone who's handling like top secret information versus classified.
Correct.
Okay, so there's different levels of what you had to meet.
Well, there's additional accommodations you have to have if you're handling classified information, but all of that information is covered under the NIST standards.
So what was the largest burden, in your experience in complying to these standards? Was it a heavy financial burden for the company, personnel time? What kind of heavy burden was that?
It was really just personnel time. It was a matter of, we had a lot of policies in place, but a lot of them didn't have the detail that they were looking for in the control families.
And it's something that the security officer for your company, I'm assuming, keeps up to date with the changing standards and making sure that your company's compliant?
As far as the security side goes, but we can't expect our security officer to be up on all the latest IT standards. That was a little more out of their realm. So in order to incorporate the security standards for the IT side, we need to have our system administrator involved. We need to have our IT supervisor, our facility security officer.
It's really a team effort that everybody has to be a part of. Okay.
Absolutely. And a lot of it too was, we had, being a small company, a lot of what we did, if we had a new person come on board, they would come and, their supervisor would say, all right, they need to give them the access to what they need, and we would give it to them. So out of the control standards, we realized that we need to have a more formal procedure in place where we had the supervisor justify and authorize access to, say, a VPN or to certain network shares. That way, we've got it in writing exactly what they need access to, and it's authorized by the supervisor.
Okay. I heard you mention NISPOM a couple of times.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is and why it's important?
Yes. It's basically the operating manual for the federal government to deal with classified information. So anything that is classified will be acknowledged and authorized. And all of your guidelines for operating classified information are in the NISPOM.
So you mentioned that our security policy here is our compliance policy is like 60 some odd pages. What do regular employees need to know and read inside of that to be familiar?
Yes, a lot of what the system security plan is a full plan on how you implement everything. For our employees, they don't have to read through the 60 or 70 page document. There are half-page policies on remote access policy, bring your own device policy, things like acceptable use. Now, these are things that, we were doing anyway, but we just didn't have it formally written down.
So since these policies can be flexible and be left for a little bit of your own interpretation per company on a company basis, aren't you worried that there's going to be like a gap between policy and procedure? And can these adapt over time, you think?
Oh, absolutely. One of the first things we did when we started creating the system security policy was note that it's a living document. It's going to breathe. It's going to change as you need to. But with the DFARS policies and the clause, it says that you are to provide adequate security. Now, they define adequate security as the right amount of security for your company to be able to be consumerate with the probability of you having information extracted or attacked or your systems being infected. So that adequate security, does vary by each company.
Now, are you concerned that there's going to be with the lack of reporting and a possible financial risk or a public image risk for companies that don't necessarily adhere to these principles and standards?
Well, it's one of those things where you are required to report and rapidly report within 72 hours of any incident or breach. It's just like other reporting. The problem is if you do not report it, you risk losing all of your government contracts.
So what would you say was the biggest benefit for, at least in your experience for your company, on complying to these standards? What was the biggest benefit that you guys gained out of complying with this?
I think the biggest benefit was that we standardized all our policies. We organized them in one place. Our system security plan was able to point to our other policies. And that way you've got one location to go, find all of your policies, and then have a link to the other policies. So you've got one-stop shopping where you can go in and find everything and be able to find those. So another thing that we did is we were fresh off our insider threat program plan from 2016. So we were able to reference that a lot and use those policies and link to the system security plan. So that made things a little bit easier.
What's maybe the biggest advice or the best advice that you can give for people that are trying to get their company up to standards and compliance with these regulations? What would be the best practice or best place to start?
Well, you need to start with your system security plan. You need to be organized. You need to download all of those controls and look at each control individually. Obviously, for us, we went through the things that we knew we were already doing well and knew where the documentation was, and we crossed those off the list first. We actually created a spreadsheet that linked the number of controls that were completed until we got them all completed. That way we could easily see, and we linked that into our
So organization is definitely the key on where people should start if they're trying to get on board.
You try to grab the low-hanging fruit first. You knock off those policies that you know you have in place and that everybody understands, and then you work your way up. And that way, too, you can knock off a number of controls. A number of the control families are linked. Do you have a policy? Yes. Do you monitor your policy? Yes. Do you update it annually? Yes. Okay. So once you start into that control family, you can finish a number of items.
I think it's important to note that even though these were regulations and compliances that existing federal contractors had to abide by, new contractors coming into the game really need to worry about this as well, and they have to be compliant before they can start hosting this kind of information.
Because there will be a clause in their contract that says that they agree to be compliant.
Which I think might even be a little bit harder for a company just coming in, because we've existed for a little while and we've had, like you're mentioning, the insider threat plan and stuff like that to reference, but a company that's starting from scratch with nothing,
correct,
to build from the bare bones.
And that can be overwhelming. There are a number of controls and there's a number of areas that small companies may not have the expertise. So that's why there are companies out there that are willing to help.
So there are third-party companies that you can hire to help your organization get up to snuff for that sort of thing.
One of the things that really helped us as well is we have a lot of experience doing the government risk management framework assessments based on the NIST 800-153 or NIST CSIAC-53, revision 4.
All the numbers.
All the
right?
numbers are starting to swirl in my head. But because we had some experience doing that, and I personally had some experience doing, risk assessments, it made it a little easier for us because we had an idea what the controls were. And then we had an idea of the families and how they related. So that made it a little bit easier.
Good. I think that's all we're going to cover for today. Thank you, Kevin, for joining me.
Very well.
If people would like to go and discuss the webinar or this interview and have any more questions, you can definitely visit www.csiac.org and visit our forums, view the webinar that Kevin gave, and ask follow-up questions, and I'm sure someone will get back to you presently. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Did you know that CSIAC offers free monthly webinars featuring experts in the areas of cybersecurity, software engineering, modeling and simulation, and knowledge management? Come see leading industry professionals talk about industry practices and leading research. Make sure to visit www.csiac.org/webinars in order to subscribe to our mailing list and see when the next webinar series is available. There you can also watch previous webinar series to catch up. Visit www.csiac.org/webinars.